chapter, we talked about how psychology evolved in terms of what was measured and studied. Now we're going to talk more about how psychologists go about doing that. The reason we need to have a scientific process is that there are so many ways in which we can be incorrect in explaining phenomenon. As described in the book, common sense isn't always accurate, and there are some roadblocks to critical thinking like hindsight bias, overconfidence, and perceiving patterns in random events that get in the way. I'll let the book cover those topics, and this video will focus more on an overview of the scientific process and method. You're likely already familiar with the scientific method from other science classes. Scientists start with a theory that explains the behaviors or events. A theory is developed trying to organize facts into a more coherent picture. The important aspect is that the theory needs to be testable. You need to be able to have testable predictions, which we call hypotheses. Once you test your hypothesis, you'll either be able to have additional support for your theory, or you'll need to reject or refine your theory. The more data that you have, the more you're able to refine your theory. To be able to test your hypotheses, you'll need to have operational definitions. Those are very precise and measurable. For instance, if you ever look at an academic journal, you'll see very specific definitions, sometimes even in the titles. For instance, there's a journal article named Psychometric Properties of the Muscle Dysmorphic Disorder Inventory Among Physically Active Brazilian College Men. The reason that these operational definitions are so important is so that you can not only accurately describe your theory, but also so that studies can be replicated. It may be that college men in the US are different from those in Brazil, or there may be differences in what constitutes physically active. When combining the results from various studies, we can get an even better idea of what works or what doesn't work. So now that you have a theory and a hypothesis, how do you go about testing that hypothesis? There are different types of methods that each have their own advantages and disadvantages. The three discussed in the book are descriptive methods, correlational methods, and experimental methods. As you read the text, pay close attention to why a researcher would use a particular method to test a particular hypothesis. For example, if you're trying to see how people behave in more natural environments, like in a classroom or a public space, using a naturalistic observation method would be more appropriate. The disadvantage of this approach is you're not necessarily able to generalize to other settings. This means that the classroom you've selected to observe, it may be different from many other classrooms to where what you observed isn't commonly seen. Correlational methods help look at the relationship between variables or traits or behaviors. Correlations are between -1 and 1, where the closer to 1, the stronger the positive relationship, and the closest to -1, the stronger the negative relationship. If the correlation's at 0, that means there isn't really a relationship between the two. Correlational research is really useful when you have data, but you can't randomly assign participants. So going back to that classroom example, students typically aren't randomly assigned to classrooms. Particularly for college courses, students self-select into a class. It may be that those who opt for an 8 a.m. class are fundamentally different from those who opt for an 11 a.m. class. Another issue with correlations is because you can't talk about causation, only that there is a relationship. And that means that there can also be what's called a spurious correlation. The classic example of this is that murder rates increase with ice cream sales. It's not likely that ice cream leads to murder. It's more likely that because there's longer daytime hours in the summer, summer's hotter, there may be more opportunity for crime. Now, experiments try to eliminate the problem of those spurious relationships by very carefully manipulating or changing just one variable. That's again why we get titles of research papers like Physically Active Brazilian Men. A key to an experiment is that participants need to be randomly assigned to a particular condition. So for that Brazilian example, you can see how it couldn't be an experiment unless you assigned people to a particular physical activity group, where you required some people to be physically active and another group to abstain from physical activity. So that example is more likely a correlational study than an experiment. For experiments, you also have to have independent variables, the things you're looking to change, and dependent variables, the outcome you're looking to measure. If I wanted to look at how music is related to creativity, It may assign participants to different groups, and for each group play one type of music, classical, rock, country, and then give everyone a creativity test. The independent variable would be the music type. The dependent variable would be the score on the creativity test. As you're going through the book, make sure to look carefully at the different types of methods and when they would be appropriate and what types of claims you can make from them. One more aspect of research methods is ethics. For studies involving animals and people, researchers need to follow certain rules that are enforced by an institutional review board. If you continue with psychology, you'll get more experience with what we call IRBs as part of your research methods course. The IRB ensures that researchers are reducing risk and making sure that people are informed of any risk of participating in research. If the risks outweigh the benefits, then the project would not be allowed. And as you go through the class, you'll likely see some examples of research that would no longer be allowed today. Studies prior to the 1970s may not have had such reviews, and since the introduction of IRBs, protection for human and animal subjects is taken very seriously.